welcome to this special Scientific Digest episode on EULAR TV. My name is Mrinalini Day. I'm an academic rheumatology trainee from Liverpool in the UK, and I'm delighted to have with me today Professor Jaap van Laar from the Netherlands. And today we're actually going to be speaking about later on in the session about his work in difficult-to-treat rheumatoid arthritis and his work surrounding that area, but also in the first part of this session about the journey that's led him to doing this work. So without further ado, Professor van Laar, would you like to maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we will get into the main discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Minnie, for this very kind invitation. I'm more than happy to tell you about my journey through time and how I got to this point of investigating difficult-to-treat rheumatoid arthritis. I would like to start with a slide which I presented some time ago during a talk in Sweden with a quote from the philosopher, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who said that life must be lived forward but can only understood afterwards. And I think, looking back at my career, it has been a little bit of a zigzag. I went into medicine because as a young child I was watching television with my grandparents, and I watched a news item of the first heart transplant by Christian Barnard in the late 60s. And as a 6-year-old, I was so kind of excited and impressed. I thought, I want to become a heart surgeon myself. So from that age onwards, I had focused my ideas of becoming a doctor, which was also nurtured by my grandmother. I think it's very important in life and a professional career that you have role models, and it's also important to acknowledge them. And my role models have all been male rheumatologists. I think that's going to change with the feminization of rheumatology. But I was trained into rheumatology by Ferry Breedveld, who was one of the past EULAR presidents. I spent some time at the NIH in Bethesda under the supervision of Peter Lipsky. I worked on a stem cell transplant project in Europe with Alan Tyndall, and I moved back to Holland to take up the position from Hans Bijlsma, who was then head of rheumatology in Utrecht, the Netherlands. But it's also important to acknowledge that you've come at a certain point because of your family life and your family history. These are my lovely parents some time ago. Fortunately, they're still alive and well and living in this nice house in the center of the country. And I think it's also important to realize that teaching is extremely important from a young age onwards. So it's like education, education, education. I've been very lucky to go to some very good schools, primary school and secondary school. I also am very happy that I did my medical training in Leiden University, which still is a very good place to go into medicine and into rheumatology. As I mentioned, I spent some time for a research sabbatical at the NIH, the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Diseases in Bethesda, with a young family, and again that was a highlight in our personal lives. I moved to England in 2007. I was invited by my dear friend John Isaacs from Newcastle to take up a chair in rheumatology. And focus research on connective tissue diseases, which is one of my hobby horses. So I worked in Newcastle and Middlesbrough from 2007 to 2013 before moving back to the Netherlands. And this is the University Medical Center in Utrecht, a huge kind of industrial complex. And my first scientific publication was actually in the New York Times. So I did my thesis on a innovative therapy for rheumatoid arthritis called Tcell vaccination, which at the time seemed like a very fancy way to tweak the immune system and induce T-cell regulation. And this was based on animal models of autoimmune disease at the time. And in 1988, we had treated our first patients worldwide with T-cell vaccination. And this lady seemed to have a very good clinical response. And so this news went out into the local journal, and from the local journal it went into the National Daily Telegraph, and from the Daily Telegraph it went worldwide. And so the Wall Street Journal, I mentioned the New York Times, but it was the Wall Street Journal first mentioned this beneficial effect. Unfortunately, the other 12 patients that we treated didn't respond as clearly. So this open label study ended without any very clear, definitive answer. And ultimately, we were forced to abandon the program because we didn't have good enough immune tools in vitro to monitor responses to the vaccine. So this was the principle of the T-cell vaccination. You would extract T-cells from the joints of patients. You would culture them to achieve high numbers of cells, tweak them a little bit, and then inactivate the membrane so that they wouldn't be live and functional when we would inject them back in the patient. And the idea was that every patient and every human being has a kind of anti-idiotypic network of T cells and B cells recognizing other T cells and B cells by the T cell receptor. And so the idea was that if you would inject pathogenic T cells inactivated, this would kind of elicit a regulatory immune response towards the cells that were injected. We struggled to develop an assay in vitro which would kind of prove that the principle worked. So the publication was in a way disappointing for us. And at the time I had read an article from Dirk van Beckham, who was an animal scientist, who had done experiments with bone marrow transplantation. And he had just published a paper in PNAS in the late 80s, showing that bone marrow transplantation is very effective in curing animals with immune arthritis. And I remember reading this article and mentioning it to Ferry Breedveld, maybe this could work in man. And of course he looked at me with an eye, you're not serious, right? You're not going to do bone marrow transplant in patients with rheumatoid arthritis. So there was a lot of kind of natural resistance to the program, but we persisted, and I set up a bone marrow transplant program in Leiden for rheumatoid arthritis and systemic sclerosis. Now, the program in rheumatoid arthritis was not so successful. We did notice significant improvements of disease activity, but all patients relapsed within 2 years. So clearly this was not a cure in rheumatoid arthritis. But in systemic sclerosis, it proved to be very effective, and on the basis of that, we designed the European ASTIS trial, which was a controlled trial and which demonstrated a benefit of stem cell transplantation over treatment with conventional cyclophosphamide. So we did some more studies. This was a syngeneic transplant paper, a case report. We thought that maybe syngeneic transplantation would be better, so we had a monozygotic twin where one patient, one had rheumatoid arthritis and the other one was completely healthy. So we reasoned maybe if we do a bone marrow transplant with bone marrow cells from the healthy SIP, we can cure the patient. But unexpectedly, and this patient had a very rapid flare of rheumatoid arthritis after the bone marrow transplant. And maybe that's not so surprising because the HLA background is completely the same. So maybe we shouldn't have been surprised. But at the time, there was one case report from Australia which reported a positive effect of a syngeneic stem cell transplant. So my career, my scientific career from then on moved slowly into difficult to treat rheumatoid arthritis, mainly translational studies. I published some studies showing that maybe TNF is not the only mechanisms that's involved in rheumatoid arthritis, and maybe that explains why some patients have more difficult disease. We also published some papers on synovial biopsies, and again this has been corroborated by recent data from England and from the States, showing that there is a subtype of rheumatoid arthritis patients who have a so-called poorly immune arthritis, synovitis type. And I'm going to talk more about that in my presentation tomorrow in the hot session on difficult to treat rheumatoid arthritis. But I must say, I've also developed more of an interest in the non-biological factors that determine the difficult to treat phenotype, like smoking, poverty. There are many other factors that influence the outcome of rheumatoid arthritis. So that's my scientific career. Now, looking back, I think one of the things that I enjoyed maybe most was my editorship for Rheumatology, Oxford. And I'm still proud to be the first non-British, having been the non-British editor of Rheumatology. But that was a really exciting time. And I think the journal is in very good shape also, thanks to the leadership, of course, of Marwan Bukhari, who's the present editor. So what are my greatest regrets in my career? I think that I have been offered opportunities which I didn't take because I was maybe too shy. For example, they asked me to come back to the NIH when I spent some time there as a medical student. I think the NIH was a wonderful, or is a wonderful research environment for someone with an interest in translational rheumatology. And I've also, of course, had some setbacks professionally. I've had some projects that failed. I'm running some projects where I'm still very concerned about that maybe they will not mature to the end that we hoped they would get to. I've also found it's quite challenging to run, for example, multi-center, especially international projects. Although I must say that the EULAR task force project was a very successful project. And I think maybe looking back, I'm very proud of the fact that we managed, despite all sorts of setbacks, to complete the European transplant trial with very little money. And this has changed, I think, the field of scleroderma treatment management to some extent. So, I think it's, when you grow older, you develop a little bit of a distance to these things, and it also, you become a little bit milder maybe in how you look at yourself. So I think for me the key lessons were that plow your own furrow and make a plan and stick to the plan. So if you're a young researcher, try to figure out what triggers your interest mainly in medicine or in rheumatologists, and try to find the gaps in knowledge and contribute to filling the gaps in knowledge. I think it's also very important to look for role models and mentors. I mean, you can't proceed in your career without a good mentor. And don't forget not only to work hard, but also to play hard. So my last slide is from a quote that I came across in the north of England, which inspired me to do what I did. And it says, "Only dead fish swim with the stream."
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Van Laar, for going through all of that with us. There's so many points I could pick up on to discuss, but I think particularly for trainees in the audience, of which I'm one, that was really, really powerful, I think. I'd like to maybe just expand a bit upon, you mentioned one of your greatest setbacks was maybe things not quite working out as you'd intended, and I think all of us have had situations where perhaps something which seems really big at the time or we think is very exciting actually turns out not to be quite so exciting. What kind of advice would you have for those of us who are in that early process of starting out in research and, maybe papers don't get published or grants don't get funded? Any particular advice you'd have?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of take the long-term view of your career. So I think anyone who pursues a career wherever, right, not just in medicine or rheumatology, but wherever you are, will experience setbacks. And I think setbacks also shape you. So you have to kind of learn the right things. You know, I think it makes you, I always use this American quote, if it ain't kill you, it makes you stronger. So, you know, setbacks are you know, part and parcel of life. And, you know, you have to work around them and take the right lessons from them. Don't, you know, turn sour. I think that's the important thing. Especially if you're young, I think you're very susceptible to disappointments, and you take it personally, and that will not help in the long run.
Thank you. And I think just going on from that, you've done work in scleroderma, and you've also done work more recently in difficult to treat rheumatoid arthritis as well. And you seem to be doing both at various points in time, side by side sometimes. I think particularly as young researchers as well, we sometimes worry, oh, you know, I'm jumping from one subspecialty to another. I don't quite know what I like just yet. Do you think there's advantages or disadvantages to that? And have you found personally that you've managed to draw from the rheumatoid arthritis work and the scleroderma work to feed into the other? Yeah,
that's an excellent question. The reason why I focused on two conditions is, first of all, it's a trick that I've learned from my colleague in Leiden, Tom Huizinga, who also betted on two horses, right? And because if one horse isn't running properly or isn't fit, then maybe you can, you know, the other horse can help you achieve your aim. So it's a bit opportunistic, I must say. My PhD started in rheumatoid arthritis, so that was kind of the first disease that I got to know. But when I was a trainee in medicine, I got intrigued by the, you know, by the extremely difficult nature of scleroderma, and also the pessimism that was surrounding scleroderma. And I'm an optimist by nature, so I thought, you know, there must be something better than this. And so when I got involved in this transplant project through rheumatoid arthritis, we essentially extrapolated the protocol to include systemic sclerosis. We did a collaborative study with Nijmegen at the time. And so we ran this Dutch pilot study. And I remember the first patient didn't respond very well, so we were a bit disappointed. But then subsequent patients had a very dramatic improvement of skin thickening, for example. And that's when we realized, you know, this is something special. This is not something that you can achieve with any other drug in scleroderma. So from then on, I also focused on scleroderma. But it's difficult to study a rare disease like scleroderma. It's easier to focus your work on a more common disease like rheumatoid.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately, on this episode for EULAR TV. But thank you so much for joining me today. I think the audience will have taken away a lot of really special and really useful bits of advice, and have been really inspired by what you had to tell us. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us on EULAR TV. We hope to see you again soon.